In this video I'm going to be discussing some of the design decisions that we've made for Meka Ape, and particularly focusing on those that impact the gameplay. So to start off, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we decided to go with a stylized approach as opposed to a more photorealistic environment. The main reason is for visibility. It's important in a competitive game that you're able to see the other players. With a more photorealistic approach, usually that means darker shadows, more debris, more environmental effects obscuring vision, and this can work if the game is aiming to be a realistic military simulator and you want it to match real life as closely as possible. However, if that's not a requirement, then usually it's more fun if the players are quite easily visible and you're not forced to stare intensely at the screen and pick out individual pixels in the distance. So whilst we're still experimenting with different styles, we're mainly going to be focusing on this cartoony, more vibrant look, because it has advantages in a competitive game. This style has another benefit where if you reduce the quality settings, there's not as much visual change in the environment. With a high detail photorealistic environment, players can get an advantage by lowering their graphics settings, which will simplify textures, simplify the lighting, and overall make it easier to see the other players, which gives an unfair advantage to those that choose to use a lower setting, where we believe that the choice of graphic settings should be down to performance, not whether or not it gives you an advantage in the game. So I'm going to quickly show through some of the graphics options which will be in the game. At the moment I'm just doing it through the editor, but the same options will be available in the games menu. So at the moment it's on cinematic quality. If I turn it down to epic, you can see some change but not much loss in visual fidelity. And then if I turn it down further, again it's a small change, not too noticeable, but the performance will improve. And then once we turn it even further down, you can see that there is some loss of quality in the lighting, but it doesn't really impact the gameplay that much, and there's not much change between this and the higher setting. There will also be an option to auto-detect the graphic settings which are most appropriate for your hardware. We've decided to use dynamic lighting for the game, as opposed to static baked lighting. What this allows us to do is change the lighting at runtime, so we can adjust time of day, the angle of the sun, the brightness, and adjust any lights on the level. And we can do this in response to gameplay events, or this could just be used to add variance between the levels, and it may be an option to allow the player themselves to set it based on their preference. In terms of the layout for the levels, we have a design philosophy based around the idea of loops. And what we mean by loops is that each path a player can take generally will loop back on itself, and the whole map is made up of small and large circles. What this means is that from any position there are multiple ways to get there, so this prevents people from camping in one spot, because in any position in the map there are multiple angles that they will have to be watching. So you will not find many corners or dead ends in the levels. However, we won't completely remove this because we still want some positions to be advantageous over others. And particularly when we start designing levels for team-based modes, there are usually more ways that you can attack a player, especially if you're playing as a team and communicating, so that camping isn't as much of an issue in comparison to in free-for-all deathmatch game modes. Our goal is to make each weapon have a unique functionality within the game, rather than just having one best weapon and then each other weapon is just slightly worse but basically the same. Each weapon can be considered the best in a given situation. And what this means is that the player will have to decide which weapon to use for the situation they're in, rather than just always choosing what they consider the best weapon. For the prototype, we have essentially 3 types of weapon, and these are all part of the same physical weapon which can be adjusted based on the fire mode. So we have a rocket launcher which fires projectiles which explode on impact and deal splash radius damage. We have the lightning gun, which is fast firing but low damage. And then we have the railgun, which is very slow firing but deals high damage. So I'm going to go over some specifics of why you would choose one weapon over another in a given scenario. So to start off, with the rocket launcher, because it fires a projectile, if you're firing at a distance, the enemy has a chance to see the rocket coming and simply move out of the way. And also, because of the travel time of the projectile, you have to predict the enemy far in advance, so if he's running around in the distance, I have to guess where he's going to be ahead of time so that when the rocket hits, he's actually in that position. This means that the rocket launcher is most useful in close range. And by close range, I mean a range where the splash damage of the rocket exploding won't damage yourself, but will damage the enemy. And this gives them very minimal time to dodge or get out of the way of the blast radius. With the rocket launcher, you'll usually want to aim at the floor or at nearby walls so that the splash radius damage will hit the player rather than going for direct shots which you're less likely to hit. You can also use this to hit players that aren't directly visible. So for example, if an enemy's hiding behind the wall and you know that they're there, you can't hit them with any direct hit scan weapon, whereas if you fire rockets near to the corner, they can damage behind the wall, and you'll be able to deal damage to a player who's not directly visible or in your line of sight. Rockets can be very effective if you have the high ground. This is because usually the floor is in a short to medium range away from you, and during the downtime whilst the gun is reloading between shots, you can hide using the floor as cover. The enemy will have a difficult time dodging many rockets firing down from above, and they can't directly hit you back because most of the time you're behind the cover. On the flip side, rockets are not effective if a player is on high ground. This is because you can't directly hit the floor underneath them, so all you can do is try to go for direct shots which they might be able to dodge. The exception to this is if there are walls nearby, so if a player is standing near this pillar, I could shoot at the pillar to deal splash damage onto him directly. But if he's just stood in the open, I would have to try and hit direct shots. Any shots that miss will not deal splash damage because they'll go completely behind him and the radius will be nowhere near. There is also the option of shooting the floor that's in front of him, which will deal some splash damage if they're close to the edge. The lightning gun is most effective at a medium range, because even though it deals low damage, it fires fast, so if the player is constantly visible in a medium range, over the course of a second you can deal a lot of damage to a player. The railgun is typically the most effective at long range. This is because it deals a high amount of damage, it's accurate, and during the downtime between the weapon reloading you can take cover. So you can fire shots, take cover, peek again, fire another shot, and so on. Whereas if you try to use it in close range, due to the rate of fire, the other enemy will be able to kill you in the meantime whilst your weapon's reloading. This covers the basic ranges that you'd want to use each weapon for, but there is a lot of nuance with that, and there are a lot of combinations that you can use which are effective. So for example, if you have slightly less health than the enemy player and you're at a medium range, you might be tempted to use a lightning gun to take a lightning gun battle if they're shooting lightning gun at you. And if you continue with this, and assuming you both have the same accuracy level, then you will die before they do because you have slightly less health. However, if you get their health down low enough, so to the point where one rail will kill them, you can take a high risk of switching to the railgun to finish them off before you die. This covers some of the basics of weapon selection, but there are a lot of high-level complex decisions that players need to make during combat. And whilst we're mainly focusing on the free core weapons for now, we will also include more experimental weapons which will have their own unique functionality and advantages and disadvantages. But we think it's important to focus on the core gameplay and get that to feel solid before we start expanding into those areas. So thanks for watching, and let us know if you have any questions about the gameplay or the technologies used or any other elements.